Sammy Hagar may have seemed like the epitome of success in the 70s and 80s, but behind the scenes there were internal conflicts going on. Hagar is ready to expose everything that was going on with his longtime bandmate, Eddie Van Halen. Join us as we reveal every detail pushing Sammy Hagar into old age, finally deciding to expose the dark side of Eddie Van Halen and everything that went on in the iconic Van Halen band. Eddie Van Halen and Sammy Hagar's collaboration in Van Halen marked one of the most successful and iconic periods in rock history. Their partnership began in 1985 when Hagar was brought in as the new lead vocalist for the band, replacing David Lee Roth. Hagar's arrival was a turning point for Van Halen, as the band had been struggling with internal tensions and a shift in the music industry. Eddie, known for his legendary guitar work, had already established himself as one of the greatest guitarists of all time, but he was seeking a new direction for the band. Sammy Hagar, a successful solo artist and former frontman of Montrose, brought fresh energy and a new vocal style that complemented Eddie's playing perfectly. Their first album together, 5150, 1986, was a massive success both commercially and critically. The album marked a departure from the band's earlier sound, embracing a more polished, radio-friendly approach while still retaining the raw energy that Van Halen was known for. Hits like Why Can't This Be Love and Dreams showcased Hagar's powerful voice and songwriting abilities, which blended seamlessly with Eddie's virtuosic guitar work. The album went on to top the charts and solidified the band's place in rock history, earning Van Halen a new generation of fans. The success of 5150 was followed by more chart-topping albums, including OU 812, 1988, and For Unlawful Carnal Knowledge, 1991. These albums continued the trend of successful commercial rock, and the band toured extensively, enjoying massive popularity during the late 80s and early 90s. Eddie and Sammy's chemistry on stage was undeniable, and their collaborations helped to push Van Halen to new heights of fame. However, despite their professional success, behind-the-scenes tensions were beginning to rise, and the dynamics within the band began to shift. For a while, though, Eddie Van Halen and Sammy Hagar's partnership was seen as a perfect fit. Eddie's innovative guitar riffs and Sammy's dynamic vocals created a rock powerhouse that defined an era. In the mid-1980s, when Van Halen was searching for a new lead singer following the departure of David Lee Roth, they found what seemed to be a perfect fit in Sammy Hagar. Sammy brought a fresh energy and a vocal power that propelled Van Halen into a new phase of success. His arrival in 1985 was heralded by the release of 5150, an album that would redefine the band's sound and solidify their place in rock history. Songs like Why Can't This Be Love and Dreams became anthems for a new generation, and the album's commercial success pushed the band into a new era. While Hagar's arrival marked a high point for Van Halen commercially, it also brought new challenges that would eventually affect the band's internal dynamics. Eddie Van Halen, known for his virtuosic guitar playing and innovative contributions to rock music, was the clear driving force behind the band. However, his growing personal struggles began to create friction within the group. Hagar, whose work ethic and professionalism were well documented, quickly realized that Eddie's perfectionism was becoming a source of contention. As Van Halen's popularity soared, Eddie's behavior began to take a toll on the band's relationships. The constant pressure of maintaining success and creating hits began to weigh heavily on Eddie, and it became clear that his struggles with alcohol and later with other personal issues were affecting his interactions with the band members. Sammy, ever the optimist, tried to keep the energy positive, but the increasing volatility of Eddie's personality began to sour the atmosphere. Despite the obvious success of albums like 5150, OU 812, and For Unlawful Carnal Knowledge, tensions between Hagar and Eddie escalated during the recording and touring for each subsequent album. Sammy, who had always been passionate about the music, found himself increasingly frustrated by Eddie's unpredictable behavior. Hagar, in interviews, would later describe the working environment as difficult due to Eddie's emotional volatility. He spoke candidly about how Eddie's mood swings and unpredictability made it hard to maintain a cohesive band dynamic. While Sammy was committed to delivering high-quality music, Eddie seemed to become more withdrawn, his behavior becoming erratic. The rise of Eddie's temper was one of the most noted aspects of their growing tensions. Hagar recounted several instances where Eddie would lash out during rehearsals and recordings. For Hagar, who valued professionalism, this was a difficult environment to work in. Hagar and Eddie's once positive creative relationship began to sour. Sammy found it increasingly difficult to get Eddie to listen to his musical ideas or collaborate in a constructive way. The strain was clear, and as Hagar later reflected, The constant emotional roller coaster took a toll on him both personally and professionally. Despite their success, the internal conflict within Van Halen began to leak into public view. The constant bickering and backstage tensions were no longer something the public could ignore. The 1991 For Unlawful Carnal Knowledge tour became notorious for the increasingly difficult working conditions. While the band was still producing hits, the tension between Hagar and Eddie became too much to ignore. In particular, Sammy would express in later interviews that he felt like he was being shut out of the creative process, particularly when it came to the musical direction the band was taking. He felt as though Eddie once again was driving the ship on his own terms, dismissing Sammy's input and sidelining him in favor of his own ideas. By 1996, after another tumultuous period of touring and recording, Sammy Hagar made the decision to leave Van Halen. His departure was fueled not just by the ongoing creative differences, but by the breakdown in their personal relationship. Sammy's frustration boiled over, and after many years of tension, he walked away in a highly publicized exit. Sammy stated that he had tried his best to make it work. The constant struggles had simply worn him down. He remarked that despite all the success, it had become impossible to continue under the circumstances. Sammy's departure was a dramatic moment in rock history, and the departure of such a key member of Van Halen marked the end of an era for the band. After leaving, Sammy Hagar would go on to have a successful solo career, while Eddie and Van Halen continued to make music with other vocalists. However, the divide between Hagar and Eddie was clear, and the two never truly reconciled their differences. Despite their years of collaboration, the underlying friction never disappeared, and the relationship remained strained for many years after Sammy's departure. The public was left to speculate about the reasons for Sammy's exit, with many pointing to Eddie's increasingly erratic behavior and struggles. Hagar himself spoke about his frustrations with Eddie in interviews, noting that their working relationship had become difficult. Due to Eddie's emotional instability in the years following, both Eddie and Sammy would occasionally comment on the state of their relationship, but there was no full reconciliation. Eddie's personal battles, including his struggles with substance abuse and health issues, took a toll on him in the years after Sammy left the band. Sammy Hagar's departure from Van Halen marked a pivotal moment in rock history. While the music and the fans loved the collaboration between Hagar and Eddie, the reality of their working relationship was much more complex. The rise of Van Halen with Hagar was one of the most successful phases in the band's history, but it was also marked by personal and professional struggles that ultimately led to Sammy's departure. Through it all, Hagar maintained that his decision to leave the band was based on a deep sense of dissatisfaction with the way things had developed. He wanted to focus on his own music and creative projects, but also make it clear that the challenges of working with Eddie had played a central role in his decision. His departure from Van Halen was a tragic end to a chapter that had started with so much promise. The story of Sammy Hagar and Van Halen is a tale of soaring heights, unforgettable rock anthems, and a heartbreaking breakdown that ultimately led to a painful departure. Sammy Hagar joined Van Halen in 1985, and at the time, it seemed like the perfect match. Hagar, with his energetic persona and powerful vocals, brought a new wave of enthusiasm to a band already on the cusp of greatness. The tension between the iconic David Lee Roth and Eddie Van Halen, however, had been brewing for years. Roth had been the original lead singer, but by the time Hagar joined, Van Halen was already navigating personal and professional struggles. The energy in the band was shifting, and it was clear that something had to change. Hagar's arrival injected fresh life into the band. His powerful, high-octane voice was a perfect match for Eddie's blistering guitar riffs. The combination of Sammy's passion for the music and Eddie's incredible skill in guitar created a magic that would produce some of Van Halen's biggest hits, including Why Can't This Be Love, Jump, and Dreams. The fans, the band, and the media were all on board, thrilled by the chemistry between Sammy and Eddie. It was clear that they had a sound that was both familiar and new, appealing to both old fans of the band and a new generation of listeners. Their albums, including 5150 and OU812, were huge commercial successes, and the band enjoyed a new wave of stardom. But behind the scenes, the perfect storm was brewing. Eddie Van Halen, despite being the genius behind the band's sound, was becoming increasingly difficult to work with. The tension was not just about music, it was personal. Eddie's issues with substance abuse were well known, but it was his erratic behavior that began to weigh heavily on the band. Sammy, ever the professional, had a more positive and driven approach to life and music. He wanted to keep the momentum going, to continue creating and performing. But Eddie's mood swings, unpredictable behavior, and growing frustration were starting to overshadow the creativity in the band. Sammy began to feel like he was pushing a boulder up a hill. In the years that followed their success, Sammy started to realize just how different his vision for Van Halen was compared to Eddie's. Sammy, who had spent years in the music industry, was determined to keep the band moving forward and maintaining a level of professionalism. He valued consistency, hard work, and focus on the craft. But Eddie, by that time, was struggling with his own demons. He wasn't the same person that had created the magic of the early Van Halen records. His personal battles with addiction were beginning to take a toll, and his behavior became more erratic. Sammy tried his best to work through it, but it was clear that the tension was taking its toll on him as well. It was during the balance sessions in the early 1990s that things started to unravel more dramatically. Sammy had always been a team player, but he felt like the situation with Eddie had become untenable. As the recording process went on, it became increasingly difficult to work with Eddie. There were heated arguments, disagreements over creative direction, and frustrations over the lack of unity in the band. Sammy had been trying to get the band to focus on making music that was meaningful and lasting, but Eddie seemed distracted by personal issues, and the band's internal struggles were only getting worse. The breaking point came when Sammy Hagar was officially dismissed from the band in 1996. By then, the relationship between him and Eddie had deteriorated to the point where it was no longer a professional one. It had become personal. Sammy had been an integral part of Van Halen's success, but the stress of trying to keep everything together had worn him down. When he was let go, it wasn't just about creative differences. It was about the inability to work in an environment that had become toxic. For Sammy, leaving the band wasn't just a career move. It was a matter of self-preservation. When Sammy left Van Halen, the media was in a frenzy. Fans were shocked, and many couldn't understand how such a successful lineup could fall apart. But Sammy's decision to leave was years in the making. He had seen the cracks in the foundation, the tension between him and Eddie, and the unhealthy environment that had developed within the band. In interviews, Sammy later admitted that while he still had a deep love for the music they made, he couldn't continue in a situation where his creativity was being stifled and where personal issues were being allowed to derail their success. The conflict wasn't just about music. It was about how the band was being run and whether they could continue to make the kind of music that fans had come to expect. The fallout from Sammy's departure was not immediate. In fact, for a while, Eddie Van Halen tried to continue on with the band, even recruiting new singers, including Gary Chiron of Extreme. But the magic that Sammy had helped create with Eddie was gone. Van Halen would never be the same without Sammy's voice, and the band's dynamic was forever altered. It wasn't just the fans who noticed the change. The members of the band, including Eddie, had to face the reality that they were no longer the same unit. Sammy's departure marked the end of an era for Van Halen, and the tension that had been building for years was now exposed to the world. Sammy Hagar's exit from Van Halen wasn't just about a departure from a band. It was the end of an era for rock music. In many ways, the energy, the chemistry, and the success they had built together in the 1980s and early 1990s could never be replicated. Sammy had been an integral part of Van Halen, both musically and personally, and his exit sent shockwaves through the rock world. It was a tragic end to a chapter that had once seemed so promising, and fans were left to wonder what could have been if the band had been able to overcome their internal conflicts and continue making music together. Despite the public drama, Sammy Hagar's departure from Van Halen also marked the beginning of a new chapter for him. He would go on to have a successful solo career, continue performing, and build a legacy that transcended his time with Van Halen. But for many, the Van Halen of the 1980s and early 1990s with Sammy at the helm will always remain a defining moment in rock history. And the question remains, what could have happened if Eddie and Sammy had been able to reconcile their differences and continue making music together? We'll never know for sure, but the music they created together continues to resonate, and their time in Van Halen remains one of the most significant chapters in the history of rock music. As the years pass, the story of Van Halen, particularly the years with Sammy Hagar as their lead singer, remains a pivotal chapter in rock history. The band's musical legacy is something that will forever be intertwined with their iconic sound, massive hits, and the undeniable chemistry that Sammy and Eddie brought to the stage. Yet, despite their undeniable success, there is still a sense of nostalgia that surrounds their collaboration and a lingering question about what could have been if the tensions and conflicts hadn't gotten in the way. In the wake of Eddie Van Halen's tragic passing, the world has been left to reflect on the band's journey, their creative genius, and the unresolved issues that ultimately led to Sammy Hagar's departure from the group. It's difficult not to look back at the 80s and early 90s without remembering the powerhouse that was Van Halen with Sammy Hagar at the forefront. The energy, the raw passion, and the commitment to making great rock music made their collaboration one of the defining moments of that era. Sammy's voice, powerful and versatile, became synonymous with some of Van Halen's most beloved songs, including Why Can't This Be Love, Dreams, Jump, and Panama. These tracks were not just popular hits. They were anthems for a generation, and the chemistry between Sammy and Eddie was the driving force behind that success. They were an unstoppable force, seemingly destined for even greater heights. And yet the internal conflicts began to grow, often going unnoticed by fans who were simply enjoying the music. The truth, however, is that the tensions between Sammy and Eddie started to mount as early as the recording of 5150, their first album together. Though they managed to create magic in the studio, the differences in their personalities began to surface. Eddie, a genius guitarist, had a creative vision that was uncompromising, while Sammy, with his more positive and driven approach, had his own way of doing things. Initially, these differences seemed manageable, but over time, the gap between the two bandmates only widened. Sammy was passionate about keeping the band's momentum going, but Eddie's personal struggles, particularly with addiction, began to affect his work and his relationships with others in the band. What followed was a series of creative disagreements, personal battles, and increasing frustration on both sides. For Sammy, this wasn't just a career, it was a family. He had joined Van Halen at a time when they were already a massive force in rock, and he had quickly become a crucial part of the band's success. Yet no matter how much effort he put into keeping the band united, Eddie's behavior started to strain their relationship. The constant volatility fueled by Eddie's personal demons made it nearly impossible for Sammy to continue working in that environment. What was once a dream collaboration turned into a painful struggle, and it became clear that something had to give. When Sammy was finally let go in 1996, it was a gut-wrenching decision, but it was also one that seemed inevitable given the circumstances. The situation had escalated to the point where it no longer made sense for Sammy to stay, and so the golden era of Van Halen came to an end, leaving fans heartbroken and wondering what might have been. In the aftermath, Sammy went on to pursue a successful solo career, but the shadow of Van Halen's legacy was always present. For years, there were rumors, speculations, and a palpable sense of unfinished business. Sammy's departure was a turning point in the band's history, and while Van Halen continued with different vocalists, something was missing. Eddie's genius could never be questioned, but the band's dynamic had changed. Sammy's presence was undeniable, and many fans continued to long for a reunion, but that was never truly possible while the tensions between Eddie and Sammy remained unresolved. In the wake of Eddie's passing in 2020, many fans and former bandmates reflected on the impact he had on rock music. His technical prowess and unique sound shaped the genre and influenced generations of musicians. But Eddie's personal struggles, coupled with the tumultuous relationship with Sammy, left a complicated legacy. Sammy, in his reflections, spoke about the pain of the years spent apart from Eddie and how they had both changed over the years. Despite the years of conflict, Sammy spoke fondly of the time they spent together, acknowledging Eddie's musical genius and their undeniable chemistry on stage. However, he also admitted that the issues between them were never truly addressed, and that in the end, the band's split was a result of their inability to reconcile their differences. What's next for Sammy and Eddie's legacy? That remains to be seen. But one thing is clear: their contributions to rock music will never be forgotten. Their time together in Van Halen created some of the most iconic music of the 80s and 90s, and the band's influence continues to be felt today. Their work with 5150, OU 812, for Unlawful Carnal Knowledge and Balance remains timeless, and fans continue to celebrate their achievement. However, the unresolved tensions between the two men will always be a part of the story. Despite their immense success, there will always be a sense of what could have been if they had been able to work through their differences. The story of Van Halen's rise and eventual fall with Sammy Hagar is a complex one, filled with triumphs and heartbreaks. But in the end, it is a story of two incredibly talented musicians who changed the course of rock music forever. Eddie Van Halen's legacy will always be associated with his innovative guitar work and his contributions to the genre, while Sammy Hagar's impact on the band's sound and his undeniable vocal talent will also be remembered. The future of their legacy is uncertain, but it's clear that their music will continue to inspire new generations of rock fans and musicians. The story of Van Halen, Sammy Hagar, and Eddie Van Halen is a reminder that sometimes even the greatest bands can't escape the personal struggles that come with fame, and that even the best collaborations can be torn apart by the pressures of life on the road and the complexities of human relationships. As fans continue to reflect on the past, They are left with a sense of nostalgia for the music that defined an era. The conflicts, the breakups, and the unresolved issues will always be a part of the story, but they shouldn't overshadow the incredible music that was created. Sammy Hagar and Eddie Van Halen will forever be part of rock history, and their legacy will continue to live on in the hearts of fans who still sing the anthems they created together.